Hello, honeys. Welcome back to our explanation of all things administrative in the news because there's just so much to cover. Today we'll be recapping what was going on in the month of May. As always, we've provided a source document for you linked in the episode description. And with no further ado, let's dive in. On May the 6th, we heard that Congress members began demanding an investigation into Trump's Smithsonian mandates. A May 1st letter addressed to the Smithsonian Inspector General Nicole Angarella, sent by 71 congressional Democrats, called for an investigation into the impact of President Trump's March executive order targeting so-called, quote, improper, divisive, or anti-American ideology, end quote, in the Smithsonian. That appeal was signed by some of the most recognizable names in progressive congressional politics, led by squad member U.S. Massachusetts Representative Ayanna Pressley and co-chair of the Congressional Museum Caucus, U.S. New York Representative Paul Tonko. The appeal's signatories argue that Angarella is obligated to analyze how the executive order will affect the Smithsonian's, quote, operational integrity as a beacon of history and culture, end quote. They are calling for this analyzation to be done through the production of thorough reports on how the Smithsonian will preserve its mission, especially documenting deaccessioning of artifacts as under the mandate, and asks her to create a plan to, quote, prevent the destruction or sale of cultural and historic artifacts, end quote. The same week saw the headline that a Senate Republican has deployed a law often used in the McCarthy era against a pro-Palestine nonprofit. Republican chair of the Senate Committee for the Judiciary, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, moved to invoke the Foreign Agent Registration Act against a New York City advocacy and culture group called the People's Forum. The act, known as FARA, was created in 1938 under the recommendation of the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities to Combat Nazi Propaganda. That committee has, of course, become associated with the 1950s McCarthy inquiries. The People's Forum itself has organized multiple large-scale pro-Palestinian demonstrations and cultural activities, including the memorial display of 17,000 children's shoes in D.C. this spring, itself meant to draw attention to the cost of children's lives in the ongoing genocide. The call for its registration with FARA means that it may soon come under the scrutiny of the FBI as well as the Department of Justice. Grassley cited this and other protest actions to argue that the People's Forum could be compelled to register under FARA. The second reason given by Grassley is its financial ties to Neville Roy Singham, who donated some of his wealth to the People's Forum after selling his tech consultancy firm ThoughtWorks and moving to China in 2017. Singham has been accused by the New York Times of, quote, funding a global influence campaign that defends China, end quote. Manolo DeSantis, executive director and founder of the People's Forum, told our sources via email that the organization has been transparent about its funding and never received funds from the Chinese government. It instead relies heavily on grassroots donations, and the People's Forum at large says that claims of ties to the Chinese Communist Party constitute, quote, a classic right-wing strategy, end quote, to undermine its dissent. Our sources were able to confirm that Grassley has sent a letter asking the Attorney General Bondi and FBI Director Patel to answer a set of questions about what the Department of Justice has done to investigate the People's Forum and its alleged ties to the Chinese government before April 30th, but as of that morning, there was no update on the request, and still, honeys, we have no public update about this story. Within the first week of May, the Smithsonian also publicly promised it would not remove anti-segregation exhibitions, thereby denying reports that its National Museum of American History and the National Museum of African American History and Culture intended to remove object displays documenting anti-segregation demonstrations during the Civil Rights Movement. Those concerns began when Black Press USA reported on April 24th that the institution, in accordance with Trump's anti-DEI executive order in March, planned to remove items related to the site of historic anti-segregation sit-ins, namely the segregated F.W. Woolworth Company lunch counter from Greensboro, North Carolina, from its displays. In response to these reports, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has seen Black churches step up to support the institution, encouraging parishioners to purchase the $25 annual membership. Among those concerned about objects they have lent is civil rights activist and pastor Amos C. Brown, who had lent the institution a book on Black history written in 1883, plus his father's Bible, which Martin Luther King Jr. had personally carried during protests. Both were returned following the Trump executive order, but the museum told NBC in April that removing these books was quote-unquote standard museum practice because the loan had expired in May. The Smithsonian denies that any objects have been removed, quote, for reasons other than adherence to standard loan agreements or museum practices, end quote, and have reminded the press in its statements that it frequently returns artifacts based on agreements with lenders, preservation efforts, and as part of, quote, regular museum turnover, end quote. However, just this week of the 27th, we saw the headline that lenders are again accusing the Smithsonian's African American History Museum of unjust removals of objects. The report published by NBC News this past weekend said that at least 32 objects have been removed from the galleries of the NMAAHC, one of the museums targeted by Trump, as we know, in that executive order on quote-unquote anti-American content in the Smithsonian's museums. And NBC News was quick to point out that there were no clear reasons given. Two lenders in particular interviewed by NBC News suggested that the removals of their objects was not standard practice. There is, as we previously covered, the case of civil rights activist and pastor Amos C. Brown, who had two objects that he lent returned, but we are now also hearing from Liz Brazelton, who had submitted the diary of her great-great-grandfather, a lawyer who worked on behalf of Solomon Northup, a free black man whose kidnapping and forcible enslavement was immortalized in the Steve McQueen film 12 Years a Slave. Brazelton claimed that the museum had returned her great-great-grandfather's diary in March, long before the end of its 10-year loan agreement in September. The museum reportedly attributed its decision to its, quote, internal gallery rotation schedule, end quote. There has been no official confirmation from anyone, honeys, that Trump's executive order has played any role in the public-facing activities of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but these returns raise red flags for many as the museum concurrently undergoes big changes behind the scenes. For example, the institution's director, Kevin Young, stepped down from his post in April, having gone on personal leave on March 14th before the executive order. Also, early this month, the Kennedy Center canceled its Pride Month schedule, and organizers for some of those events relocated them. The Associated Press reports that artists involved with the Kennedy Center's Tapestry of Pride, scheduled during DC's World Pride Festival, occurring June 5th through 8th, have been informed that the events have either been canceled entirely or moved to other venues. Washington's Capitol Pride Alliance disassociated from the Kennedy Center entirely following these cancellations, said the deputy director of the alliance, June Crenshaw, quote, "We are a resilient community and we have found other avenues to celebrate. We are finding another path to the celebration, but the fact that we have to maneuver in this way is disappointing," end quote. A separate representative for Capitol Pride Alliance clarified in a Friday statement to NBC Washington that while the reporting by the AP was accurate, not every Tapestry of Pride event was canceled by the Kennedy Center. Instead, the Capitol Pride Alliance chose to relocate its events to, quote, ensure our entire LGBTQ plus community will be welcome. These events have not been canceled, end quote. What's fascinating here is that while at least 26 performances have been canceled, 15 of those cancellations were made by the acts themselves. Cancellations at the Kennedy Center seem to be a new way of protesting Trump's self-appointment as its chairman, as we've seen the cancellation rate skyrocket since his takeover of it. This includes Issa Rae's canceled February 14th show, as well as a canceled February 13th show by the Philadelphia rock and soul band Low Cut Connie, set to occur the following month. In another story, which would have made it into the 5-06 business, Trump fired Biden appointees from the Holocaust Museum board. The New York Times reported that the president fired multiple board appointees who oversee the museum in D.C., which were made by former President Biden on Tuesday, including the former second gentleman, Doug Emhoff. The council itself is traditionally composed of up to 68 members, 55 appointed by the sitting president, 5 appointed by the Senate, 5 from the House, and 3 selected by the Department of State, Interior, and Education. It meets twice a year to oversee the institution's policies and practices, to plan nationwide days of remembrance, and spearhead recommendations outlined by the President's Commission on the Holocaust, began under former President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. Mr. Emhoff, himself Jewish, was appointed to the typically 5-year role in January of this year. He said in a statement on Tuesday, quote, "Holocaust remembrance and education should never be politicized. To turn one of the worst atrocities in history into a wedge issue is dangerous, and it dishonors the memory of 6 million Jews murdered by Nazis that this museum was created to preserve," end quote. Trump then went on to name 8 new appointees to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Board Thursday night in a social media post. We noticed this headline especially, honeys, because the news comes as Trump continues to threaten university campuses with cuts in federal funding for claims of anti-Semitism on their campuses, while leaders from America's top top universities have formed a private collective against the administration in response. And finally, the beginning of the month came with the news that Trump is now aiming to eliminate funding for the NEH and the NEA entirely in his new 2026 budget proposal. The proposal, submitted Friday afternoon, would have immediate repercussions for funding for the arts and humanities across the U.S. if passed. It would directly impact agencies and the various nonprofits that rely on their funding to make arts, education, cultural, historical pursuits, and learning across this country possible, especially by affecting the 56 state and territorial humanities councils that are funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. The budget would also eliminate the third agency to experience major cuts to its 2025 budgets in the last month, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Phoebe Stein, president of the Federation of State Humanities Councils, which supports the NEH-funded State Humanities Council's works, stated, quote, "The work of state and jurisdictional humanities councils includes programs that help veterans heal, teach children to read skillfully and think critically, and provide grants to grassroots volunteer-driven projects that simply would not happen without the resources of humanities councils," end quote. Thankfully, though, honeys, we saw almost immediate pushback to those plans, namely in the form of 3 humanities organizations suing the National Endowment of the Humanities over its dismantling. The suit was filed May 1st in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, and the plaintiffs in it are the American Historical Association, the Modern Language Association, and the American Council of Learned Societies, who say they represent thousands of individual and organizational members who, quote, "rely on NEH to fund and support their projects in the humanities," end quote, and have thus, quote, "suffered immense harm," end quote, from the NEH's dismantling. The American Council of Learned Societies itself represents 81 scholarly organizations that are included in its federation. These include not only its 2 counterparts in the lawsuit, but also the College Art Association. The suit aims to reverse the $65 million U.S. worth of April cuts in grant programs to the NEH's $210 million budget. Around 65% of the staff was fired as part of the cuts as well. They want to change that. And the suit said the endowment, quote, "is now left as a shell of the agency," end quote. And finally, a bit of good news from that week. A temporary restraining order was issued by the U.S. District Court on May 1st to block the Trump administration's dismantling of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, just days ahead of a mass layoff of nearly all its employees that was slated to take effect. The preliminary injunction against DOJ's dismissal of most of the IMLS's 75-person staff last month was granted in response to the lawsuit filed by the American Library Association and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees against Trump, the IMLS, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. United States District Judge Richard J. Leon said in his ruling that the Trump administration's conduct undermined nearly $300 million in congressional appropriations. He also found that, quote, "wholesale termination of grants and services and the mass layoffs," end quote, appear to violate parts of the Museum and Library Service Act of 2003. That act outlines the responsibilities of the IMLS director and stipulates that that person should possess, quote, "special competence with regard to library and information services," end quote, and regularly conduct research in the field, both things we know its current leader, Keith Sonderling, does not do. American Library Association President Cindy Hull said in a statement, quote, "even with a temporary restraining order, Congress also must act to ensure our nation's libraries can continue to serve their communities, including by funding IMLS for next year," end quote. It was unclear at that point in time what jurisdiction Leon's restraining order has on the administration's request for complete defunding of the IMLS. The very next week, 5-20 saw multiple other organizations follow this lead. The Authors Guild sued the National Endowment for the Humanities as well as DOJ in a class action suit filed Monday by the organization along with independent scholars and writers. The suit was brought forth by the DC-based law firm Fairmark Partners, LLP, on behalf of all individuals who were awarded grants that were unexpectedly canceled last month. These include individual grantees under the Public Scholar, Fellowship, Summer Stipend, and other NEH programs. The suit's main argument is that these are actions that violate the Administrative Procedure Act because the Constitution guarantees the separation of powers and the freedom of expression. It further argues that these actions taken exceed the congressionally granted authority of both DOJ and the IMLS. It ultimately seeks to stop the mass termination of grants, to restore funds to the grantees, and to require the government to operate the NEH in in accordance with Congress's intent, quote, to honor and preserve its multicultural artistic heritage as well as support new ideas, end quote, as outlined in its original legislation. Almost concurrently, Doge was sued in Oregon. The previously mentioned Federation of State Humanities Councils and Oregon Humanities jointly filed a lawsuit in federal district court on Thursday against the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Department of Government Efficiency for, quote, the disruption and attempted destruction, end quote, of the NEH and 56 state and jurisdictional humanities councils. These organizations are also seeking the restoration of terminated grants and to ensure that congressional appropriations flow to humanities councils, where they were scheduled. The increasing number of organizations taking government agencies to court is so important, honeys. It's a sign of strength and resilience from these organizations who are not willing to go quietly, and brings the culture wars into a legal setting, makes them actual legal battles. And that's nothing to overlook either. And so with that in mind, I'd like to leave us for today with some good news from the week of the 27th. Museums had a reason to be cautiously optimistic as some federal grants were reinstated that week. The IMLS began reinstating grants Wednesday, May 21st, which, as we previously covered, were revoked by the Trump administration via the formerly Elon Musk-led Department of Government Efficiency. The reinstatement follows not only the lawsuits we have covered in this episode, but also one filed by a coalition of attorneys general representing 21 states against Trump's March executive order aiming to dismantle the IMLS and other organizations deemed quote-unquote unnecessary. In a 4-sentence letter emailed to recipients on that day and reviewed by Hyperallergic, the IMLS's acting director, Keith Sonderling, notified grantees that their award was being restored in accordance with the court's preliminary injunction, blocking some of the defunding and staff-cutting moves from these agencies. The Obama-appointed federal judge, John McConnell, ruled that Trump's executive order violated the Administrative Procedures Act, as filers of the lawsuit suspected, ignoring, quote, unshakable principles that Congress makes law and appropriates funds, end quote. This preliminary injunction ruling is a significant win for those advocating for a federal court-ordered reversal of the sweeping cuts to government arts and culture funding for organizations across the U.S. It is also the second recent legal victory for IMLS workers and shows how the courts remain one of the few bulwarks against the administration. But as the email itself points out, this could very well change down the line, as it does inform recipients of a pending appeal that, quote, may affect the reinstatement of your grant in the future, end quote. And museums are right to be hesitant here, as Japanese American National Museum in LA President Ann Burroughs told Hyperallergic, quote, this does not change the fact that grant programs that fund education, preservation, and other programs have been completely eliminated, devastating humanities and arts programs in countless communities, nor the ongoing efforts to suppress voices labeled as DEI in arts and education, end quote. There is your update for this month of May, honeys. I hope that it was as much a source of information as it was a source of hope here. We should never give up hope on the things that matter to us, and as you all know, this matters to me. If anything, I hope the information that you were presented with today inspires you to continue to speak out for what matters to you as well. Wishing you all a safe and happy entrance to June, Pride Month, woohoo. I remind you, as always, to take care, to hydrate or dihydrate, and we will talk soon. This episode, as well as our podcast, was produced, created, hosted, fact-checked, and formerly edited by yours truly, master's degree holder, Celia Bugno. And you can once again thank Chris Meinhold for our sound editing, as well as our intro-outro music. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.